got to be careful of too. Many times when you're studying in some of these sections of the Bible, people could use that and say, well, see, they were all divided before Bible because it's mentioned. But this is just the chapter that's explaining those generations to us of what happened after the Tower of Babel. So again, these were these people that were divided in their lands, everyone after his tongue, after their families, in their nations. So again, you've got these groups of people that spoke different languages, that were in family groups out of different nations. And as we've mentioned here, these cities and places, these countries, that they're listed. Now, let's go on to verse 6. And again, like I said, I know we're way hitting the high spots here, so we have to, this would be good deep dives, after class or maybe some in your own time. But so as we go on here in verse number 6, we see the sons of Ham, the sons of Ham. So as we go through those, we see in verse 7, we see Cush. We've heard about those folks before. Verse 8, and Cush begat Nimrod, and he began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. So obviously, we've studied the Word of God, and we know that they're just back in chapter number 9 that they come off the ark, and now the animals, the fear and the dread was, people was turned into hunters, weren't they? So now we couldn't really have a mighty hunter before the flood, but now we can have a mighty hunter after the flood. So Nimrod was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. So we see that in verse 10. So again, as you go through these, we see names, and we see these different people that, again, started after Babel here. And verse 11 tells us, here out of the land went forth Asher and builded Nineveh. So, boy, we've heard about Nineveh, haven't we? With, again, the book of Jonah. So, again, many names throughout here that we see. And we go on down, it says in verse 15, and Canaan begat Sidon, and his first one Heth, and the Jebusite, and the Amorite, and the Girgashite. So, again, we're getting into these ites and things. So again, throughout the scripture, when you hear these names, you see that a lot of them are the descendants of Ham, Shem, and Japheth. So here we see obviously Canaan. Verse 19, we see some names we remember. So it's talking about from the border of Canaanites, from Sidon, you go down, you see into Gaza. That's a name we still hear today, isn't it? As thou goest unto Sodom and Gomorrah. So there's definitely a couple names that we recognize. Verse 20, these are the sons of Ham, after their families, after their tongues, in their countries, and their nations. So now we've went through Ham. So now we look at Shem. So verse 21, and to Shem also, the father of all children of Eber, the brother of Japheth, the elder, even to him were the children born. So as we kind of go on down through here, we see in verse 10, we saw Babel. We saw verse 11, Nineveh. Verse 15, talking about Canaan. Again, we talked about Gaza in verse 19 and Sodom and Gomorrah. And as we go on down now in verses 21 through verses 32, we see people like Aram. And so Shem, let's look in verse 23. And the children of Aram, Uz, and Hul. So you see Uz, where do we hear about? Boy, that's something that's kind of odd, but we see it over in the book of Job, don't we? So again, it's neat when you start putting some of these together, and people that's a lot smarter than I am, I'm sure it's pretty neat when you see them on a map. But, when you think about these lands and these people that we talk about, I think next week we're going to be discussing about Job. When he lived in the land of Uz, there we see as a descendant of Aram. Verse 31, these are the sons of Shem, after their families, after their tongues, in their lands, after their nations. These are the families of the sons of Noah, after their generations, in their nations, and by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood. So again, the Bible does a real good job there, if you will, about just explaining. I mean, it's very, although the names are hard to say, but it's very simple to understand verse 31 and 32. These are the sons of Shem, after their families, after their tongues and their lands, after their nations. These are the families. We mentioned Shem, Ham, and Japheth. These are their families, after the sons of Noah, after their generations, in their nations. And by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood. So, of course, then we move in to chapter number 11, and the whole earth was one speech and one language, and we know what happened there. We've talked about that the last few weeks. So, as far as looking at a time frame, if you look at chapter 11 here, down in verse number 10, we didn't cover this the last few weeks, but you see these are the generations of Shem, and Shem was 100 years old. And then talks about his family after that. So again, it expounds a little bit more than chapter number 10 expounded. So now it's putting time frames. So again, if you do the math, and we don't have time to do all that today, but if you do the math when you're studying this, and it's interesting how so many people's got different opinions. My Scofield Bible puts it about 2,247 years before Christ. I think our lesson series this morning has it at 2,242 years before Christ. So again, you see there's a little 5-year difference just in two different people there between Scofield and our lesson this morning. So anywhere, and then it was neat because they even summarized it in our lesson as around 2,240 BC. So again, somewhere around 2,240 BC is the time frame here that we're talking about with Babel. In light of all of these names and knowing that the people were scattered by their families, it says how many different language groups were formed by Babel. Our lesson says somewhere around 70 different nations would have been formed and scattered across the globe. I found that kind of interesting. So around 70 different nations would have been formed and scattered across the globe. I mean, it's massive scattering there if you really think about that. So as we go on through our lesson, a lot of this I just kind of wanted to read this morning because I think it probably explains it better than I could. And as you think about this, but as the people were spreading from Babel, they would have been traveling into new territory that had never been settled by people before them. So what it's talking about is, as you see, as the Lord came down, so they were all building this city whose tower may reach to heaven, and they was making themselves a name. And the Lord came down, remember, he confounded their languages, that they didn't understand one another's speech. So then verse 8 of chapter 11 says the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. So as the Lord scattered these people, if you think about it and just use a little bit of common sense, they obviously faced some challenges. So one thing we're going to look at this morning, and we're going to kind of get into the challenges that they faced and kind of how history and science and people's labeled these different crowds as we know them, like in the Stone Age or cavemen. We hear that a lot. Pastor Cody had something interesting there when I went to see him a minute ago on his computer about Darwin's theory. And of course, we've debunked evolution all the way through 30-some weeks of lessons here. But there's something else interesting that happens that Darwin says occurred with the race of people in evolution versus what we're studying comes from the Bible. So if just to use a little bit of common sense this morning. Now, we've talked about how all these different languages, these people groups, these generations, these nations, right here, just our lesson said 70 nations could have been spread abroad from just the Tower of Babel. But we can't soon forget, and it feels like, I've just been rambling for about 5 minutes, and it seems like we already forget, or I do in my mind because I'm finite, is that, listen, just a few chapters ago, we had 8 people walked off the ark. So as we know, and as we're going to study toward the end, that all living came from Adam and Eve. And then now after the flood, that if we've had this catastrophic flood and we only had 8 people alive. So we've talked about Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So again, we're talking about just a few select people, and now they're getting divided up between their grandsons and their great-grandsons, and these nations are getting formed. And we can't ignore the fact that just a few chapters ago, 8 people stepped off the ark. So that's going to be very interesting here in a minute as we look forward. So these people that were scattering, it says, what challenges might they have faced? And if you think about it, that they wouldn't have had time or had they would have had to find food. They couldn't have obviously just carried everything with them. They'd have had to find shelter. So the easiest thing just from studying the Bible that we know about shelter is that tents would be ideal. But we also know from just even modern day of where we're at even as a society about how people use caves. It was pretty smart of them to use caves during then. They could have used the animals to haul these things. The condition would have been similar to those of nomadic tribes that we still see today. One of the, even in today's society, it's interesting because after 9/11, we went after the most wanted man in the world, and he was sophisticated enough to pull off the 9/11 attacks. And it's just like sin. We're not trying to build Osama bin Laden up, but now listen, this wasn't just some bank robbery that he planned. He planned an attack on our nation that superseded that of Pearl Harbor. And where'd that man hide? And hid for a long time until they found him in Pakistan. He hid in caves. And, a lot of times through history has dumbed those people to, they were cavemen and they weren't very educated. But we know that that's not the case, is it? And we've seen that ourselves with our own eyes. And as we see that. So it's interesting how we categorize people many times. And, we look back in life as we study through maybe our school years and stuff about cavemen and things. But we see that today even with, the most modern is over in Afghanistan. But that's a sophisticated group of people communicating the same message all over the world. So again, as we think about these things, I don't want your mind to get too far in the thinking, boy, this was just an uneducated group of people. It says, would each family have had all the skills that were present in the larger community at Babel? I enjoyed this because I think this is kind of common sense. Now I know we're deviating a little bit from the Bible and just kind of talking about, this would make sense here. So what this is talking about is you've got people with certain set of skills. Everybody in this room don't do the same job every day. If we did, life would be pretty boring, wouldn't it? Or we'd have real good roads or real good schools or real good something. But we all have different jobs. So, it would stand to reason that when they were building this tower and city here at Babel, that as those people left, you had some that was real good at this job or real good at this task, and you had others that was real good at this. So as those people scattered abroad, you probably had some that was real good hunters. You had some that was good with animals. You had some that was more intellectual than others. So again, you had these people scattered abroad, but they had different skills, and that's what it's talking about. Certain people would have been more able than others. It says, discuss the various challenges you would face if you had to move 500 miles in any one direction. So again, many problems. I kind of like this. It talked about, said, you probably would find a rock or a strong stick to use for a hammer if you needed one for a while. So, it's not saying that the things that we found through history are false, but if you really think about these folks that scattered, they probably went through a time where they did use artifacts and things that we find today because they were scattered. They were traveling great distances to get where they were going. Says this is often a stereotype of people who use stone tools. Scientists often describe this time as the Stone Age and the people as unsophisticated, without culture, and relatively unintelligent. From a biblical perspective, we might better understand these people as those who were spreading out after Babel and making use of what was available. The artifacts that we find must have been left after the flood, or we wouldn't be able to find them in layers so close to the surface of the earth. Again, it talks about the shelter. It talks about using caves or tents. It talks about, how might you explain cavemen? It says these were simply people who were living in caves from shelter, some temporarily as they traveled, and others for permanent shelter. Eventually they established cities and began building structures. So again, I think we sometimes categorize that group of people, but by studying this morning, it helped maybe to understand that, obviously, if I'm moving my family, and I don't know, I wasn't alive during that time, but if I'm moving my family, it makes good sense that, maybe we had a tent, maybe we didn't, or maybe the weather turned bad, that if I come across a cave, it's probably behooves me more to stay the night in that cave with my family than it does and to set up shop there until I can build a house or a home or whatever. And if you think about that, it's very intelligent. I think sometimes through history we've dumbed that down. One thing that I find interesting, I thought it fell in a little bit this morning, and this goes back to what Pastor Cody was talking about here in a minute, or what the picture that he had this morning. But before that, I think it's amazing that, and I think you got to be careful, so it's probably not directly linked, but I just think it's amazing that sometimes we feel where we're at as a society. And so what I'm talking about is now, my children, 10 and 6, they can pretty much use a cell phone, navigate it. My son learns my password quicker than I learn it. They can navigate. And it's funny that we have things that we now call emojis. And as you know, they're little pictures, and they're smiley faces and frowny faces and about every other thing you can think of, and about 100 different kinds of hearts and 100 different kinds of faces and things. And, I couldn't help but in my mind when I first started seeing those things, is you think back to even the Egyptian culture of hieroglyphics and those pictures. But here's something interesting. And, and we looked at that and as a society and think, boy, that's how people communicated. Back in Egypt and things, look, they drew these pictures and they communicated. Well, we as a society ain't much further than that. Well, the thing about it is as you studied that, though, hieroglyphics told more of a story. They were more, if you send somebody a winky face, that's what that means. It don't mean much past that. If you send somebody a smiley face, that's what it means. It's very symptomatic. And what's interesting to me, though, is as a society, many times we revert back to those things, and you think, well, those people were really, maybe you could say, uneducated. Look, they drew pictures to communicate on the rocks, and we found those, and you can Google that and see images and things. But it's neat because we've actually gone back now even past that, and the little symbols that we use don't even mean as much as the hieroglyphics do to those people. Very symptomatic to, like I said, a smiley face or a winky face, and we think we're so educated. And it amazes me sometimes. And, when you look at those things, I can't help but think it's so interesting how sometimes we think we're so smart, but in that, it's almost like we're dumbing down our own society. And I mean, we study and think, well, how foolish would that be to paint pictures? I mean, they couldn't even talk to one another. Or they're drawing pictures. And man, we do it today by text. We don't talk to people either anymore. And we send pictures, and we send smiley faces and text. And I tell you, I really do. I really believe that in my heart, that I think that as a society, sometimes we look down on that, and boy, we're reverting back and actually going further away from it than what it's less educated. It don't mean that much. And, the same, so again, bleeding into something else this morning. So what's interesting is when you, and listen, I'm not a scientist and I'm not a doctor, and boy, some of this stuff I really just don't understand, and I just got to believe it. But, when you go back and you study, and we know in our heart, because we believe the Bible, that there was 8 people got off the ark that day. And that all these nations are spread from these folks. Darwin's theory, and again, I've heard about it in school, studied it when I had to or whatever, but Cody had an interesting picture this morning on his computer. And Darwin says that the Caucasian, what we would call a white male, or however you want to categorize that, is an advancement of a black man. That's very interesting. So when you look at that, he had a nice picture this morning that depicted that. That when you study evolution, that evolution teaches that as man evolved from an ape, that he was a dark-skinned individual, and as he's advanced in his learning and as he's advanced in culture, then that same person that came from a monkey that was black in color has now the end result is a Caucasian male. Now, I can say that this morning because to us in here, we're sitting here smiling thinking, oh my goodness. But listen, we sit here with weird faces thinking, what in the world? But we're raising up a generation of people that we see right now today. Anytime you turn on the news of a racial divided country, nations, and people, and anybody that don't believe the Bible is getting taught that from their youth. That we're a group of folks today as white, American, whatever, Caucasian, whatever you want to call it, that we, because through Darwin's evolution, are better than a black man. They're teaching the same junk that they use to sell as a society today that a group of people's racist. But you and I, from even our youth in toddlers and in nursery, red and yellow, black and white, they're all precious from His sight. So as we study, the Bible backs up that. Because if that junk there in that picture is nothing but hogwash, because we know from studying the Bible that there was a time when 8 people got off the ark. And that from that, these generations and these nations of people were spread abroad. So what does this mean? So it's talking about how we're all made from the same blood. So this is kind of a strange place to go to talk about this, but the Bible alludes to it here. So when Paul's standing on Mars Hill in Acts, when Paul gives his great sermon there from Mars Hill, down in Acts chapter number, and you can turn there, just write this down, but in Acts 17, down in verse 24, it says, God that made the world and all things therein, seeing that He is the Lord of heaven and earth, dwelleth not in temples made with hands, neither is worshipped with men's hands, as though He needed anything, seeing He giveth to all life and breath and all things, and hath made of one blood all nations of men, for to dwell on all the face of the earth, and hath determined the times before appointed, and the bounds, talking about the boundaries. We just read some of those this morning. I didn't do them justice because I can't say all the names, but talking about the bounds of their habitation, that they should seek the Lord, if haply they might feel after him and find him, though he be not far from every one of us. So in that one verse, verse 26, and hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on all the face of the earth, and hath determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation. So just on that one verse, we talk about every nation on all the face of the earth that God has determined, and we read some of those this morning, these allotted boundaries. So what does this one blood refer to? Blood's the symbol of life. We see that throughout all the Bible. This phrase here is intended to show this common relationship, being of one blood, of all humans, making up all nations of the face of the earth. Today we use the term, well, what do we use? Blood relative, to refer to those who are directly related to within our families, rather than by marriage or adoption. A bloodline as a family lineage, so all mankind can be traced back to one man, Adam. So in Genesis 3, we look back and we think about Eve being referred to the mother of all living. So as we think about all the different people groups and ethnic groups that we see around the world today, they are really all part of one race, the human race. The differences that we see in facial features, hair type, skin color, hair texture, and eye shape can all be explained by the fact that families carried their traits with them to different regions of the globe. These traits became concentrated in certain areas, and different people groups and ethnicities were established. Over time, there has been a mixing of those traits, but all can trace their origin back to Babel, then to the ark, and ultimately to Adam and Eve. The main color of our skin comes from the pigment called melanin. The difference between the skin and maybe another person's skin in the room or whatever is the amount of melanin stored in our skin. The more melanin you have, the darker skin you have. Goes on to talk about Adam and Eve, how they, what color they think their skin was. So some basic genetics can help us understand why this is a reasonable conclusion. So this melanin, talking about it. We know that skin color is based on genes we inherit from our parents. If your parents have light skin, you're likely light skinned, vice versa. If you have a parent with dark skin and the other with light, you'll likely have something in the middle. You would have genes for dark skin and light skin. But see, to me, when you think about that, and again, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a doctor, and I don't understand all that. But at the end of the day, though, to me, it's a lot easier to believe that and to understand that, because that's what we see. I mean, I think sometimes we make stuff so more complicated than what it really is. And, we teach kids at a young age, when you mix colors, that you get a different color. And, that don't take too big a rocket scientist to figure that out. And it's the same way in life. I think as you mix these colors, you see different colors and different things come out of it. You see different concentrations. It used that word, concentration. I mean, you see the different people groups that are still concentrated in people groups today. And, I think it's so amazing, but it seems like as a society we've gotten so far from it. And it's so simple. And, when you think about that, it's just what we're talking about this morning. It seems that although this gives us a very elementary start of understanding how the different people groups came to be, it's that one that firmly grounded in the Bible that, again, as we studied back and we read this morning in chapter number 10. Let me get back there and show you. But it says, these are the families of the sons of Noah after their generation in their nation, and by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood. So I just, again this morning, I find it kind of interesting as we study that. I know I barely scratched the surface, and that kind of took us all the way through our lesson. But, again, I think as we study the Word of God and study this, it's so interesting to me that even as people that we cling on to wild ideas, or our nation does, but then that's the same people that, best we can come up with a smiley face or a different way to share a heart. And yes, sir.
When you think about the human race, and there was that day, there were 8 that got off the ark. The world population beginning in 2022 was 7.8 billion people. Okay? We think of the dispersion at the Tower of Babel. Okay? From the flood to the Tower of Babel, we're talking about 110 years. Was the gestation period shorter during that time? What was the population of the earth at Babel before the dispersion? Because we're only talking about, according to creation science, we're only talking about 110 years from the flood to Babel. So what was the world population? When the population, the human race was dispersed, how many were there?
Yeah.
Interesting thought.
It is. It is. And it's like you said, and that raises, and I've heard the same thing, that raises other questions. Was gestation period shorter then? Was, it's the same way, when you even talked about the dinosaurs, there was even some question that says, well, did these animals have need for canines and things if they weren't meat eaters and they're just grass eaters, or did the Lord allow them to develop those after obviously somebody got a taste for that stuff, but same way. Yes, ma'am.
Well, you look at also at the genetic makeup at that time.
Yeah.
When the 8 got off the ark, the genetic makeup was very limited.
Yeah.
See
Yeah.
what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
As scientifically can see, so as in that 110 years, how far along had things mutated? Because mutation takes place, that's why we have all these
Yeah.
different colored eyes and
Yeah.
different colors of skin, just
Yeah.
different things. Genes change, bodies are changing, but we're still the same race. So speaking from my science background, you think about in just that little bit of time, how far has the genetic makeup of man changed and was different? So if you look at the genetic makeup of Fred and the genetic makeup of me, it's very different because of the families we came from. But they all came from the same family.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and really, I guess,
So you think about it hadn't changed that much.
and I guess really other than Shem, Ham, and Japheth's wives, that was really the only outside influence, right? As far as we know.
Yeah, but before the flood, there wasn't that much time.
That's right. Yeah, again, yeah. That's and like Fred's saying, in a very short amount of time at that. So when you impute that with the 110 years, boy, it's amazing.
You could have had all blue-eyed people.
Yeah.
It hadn't really changed that much.
Yeah. It's just,
You can't think of how it was then compared to how it is now. Your
Yeah.
mind doesn't go there. You don't. It was
Yeah.
so different.
well, and a lot of folks that like Fred was even alluding to there too, that and Miss Sharon, was when you study that, it's just like the animals. I'm more diverse than animals.